Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism. I hope you and yours are well. By the time you're watching this, I will be in Germany. And hopefully I'm in a really good mood just now. But the show must go on, as they say. Now, Eva, she's out pounding the beat, knocking the doors, getting the leaflets out there, talking to the folk, same as Sally. One of our techies is up there as well, helping out. So we're just come up, we thought we had to give you a show, and we're doing that. There's a lot of other things happening. As we mentioned in our last show at the weekend, this is a non-election that's been going on really in the UK. It's kind of boring. We've covered a lot of it. So we're going to cover some other topics. And to do that, I'm joined by two writers. Of course, immediately I've got our Lloyd is with us. Lloyd, how are you, my friend?
Well, Roddy.
Good.
Very well.
Always a pleasure to see you. Never short. And of course, our dear friend from over the water, our Irish cousin. It's our Finbar. Finbar, how are you, my friend?
Well, Roddy, well, Lloyd, hello, Scotland and beyond. How are you?
Oh, we're good. Great. Much better when we've got you for company.
Oh, thank you.
Much better. So it's actually a very good place to start because, of course, us Brexiteers now have had no election this weekend for Ireland, for the EU, but of course in Ireland you did, as did the whole of Europe, all the sane people. It was a heck of an election. I mean, if we'd start locally for me over in Ireland, because two of my favourites, probably two of the only MEPs I like, Finbar, Mick Wallace and Claire Daly, sadly did not get returned. But it was overall, throughout Europe, some strange results come up.
It was a massive loss. I think it is a massive loss.
Yeah,
losing Claire Daly. And I haven't seen the news over the last few hours, so I don't know if Mick Wallace is still in the counting. You may know more than me on that. But from an anti-war, anti-colonial point of view, Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, if they're lost, but particularly Claire Daly, is a loss not just to Ireland, but to the globe. She has been appreciated for her ability to use words to cut the legs from under imperialists within the EU and beyond the EU, to cut the legs from under the warmongers and the industries and the businesses that make money from war. And she has done that consistently to the point that she is at times appears to be a lone political voice globally speaking against these things. Now, there are other issues and subject matter that I fundamentally don't agree with Claire Daly on, but the worth that she has, to my mind, we can disagree on other matters, but the value that she has given in her service over the last number of years as an MEP is just, it can't be calculated in terms of value for the contribution that she's made. It's a massive, massive loss. She did really well. And she did well considering that in the Irish Republic, for the last 2 weeks in particular, there has been a vitriolic campaign against her by corporate and public media that's insinuating that she's a paid Russian agent, that she's a Vatnik, as some of them call her, that she's a Putin spy, all this kind of rubbish, because she speaks clearly what many people think. And her opinions are not pulled out of the air. She is contacted on a regular basis by some of the biggest experts because they know that she will speak the truth. And so her opinions are very valid opinions. But there was this campaign within corporate and public media in the Irish Republic over the last 2 weeks, so vicious that I've never seen the likes of it before, aimed at Claire Daly. She still polled very, very well, considering that campaign that it was against her. And I don't believe that Claire Daly is going to disappear into the sunset. She's too strong-willed a person for that, and she's too passionate a person for this planet and this world and the people in it to just walk away from things. I won't be surprised to see her having her own high-profile show on some network over the next while and campaigning and representing organizations that are against war, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in Palestine.
Yeah, it was some strange results throughout Europe, Lloyd. I mean, the government's, Macron's Renaissance Party in France took an absolute beating, and Le Pen's National Party twice the votes that they took. And subsequently, he's called an election of the lower assembly in France. Big gamble, but again, took an absolute beating. It would seem that those who have been, the Zelensky curses, I like to call it. Yeah, stick that up, Techie. Yeah.
Yeah. No, what I find interesting about it, Roddy, is that I think the background to this is the disconnect between particularly the party machines and the leaders and the actual electorate. I think there's a lot of protest votes going on. I think in France particularly, this is not, I don't read it as this far right swing of the whole of the French population. I get the idea that they're sick of Macron, particularly because of his suggestions that France on its own will send troops to the Ukraine. France doesn't want that. The biggest bonus out of it, though, is the idea that there's going to be a popular front from the centre and the left to challenge in France, and that's going to be very, very positive. The results from Germany, where again it appears that people are taking a rightward swing. Now, they have done in the east of Germany, but that's been going on for about 20 years now. But again, I see this as being very much a protest vote against what their government is doing. And frankly, the European election was the first time that these people have had a chance to voice or exercise their opinion at the ballot box. And I think it would be too easy to say that this is the rise of the right. And funnily enough, it seems to be the party leaders of the centre parties who are screaming that this is a return of the right. Because if that were true, when there is a rise of the right in Europe, a central part of it is always Italy and Spain. And in both, I mean, in Italy, things stayed about ixy-pixy, but in Spain, there was a big wins, particularly for the left, but more importantly than that, for the pro-independence left of Galicia, the Basque Country, and Catalonia. They swept the board, and the reason and the platform they stood on was exactly the same platform as Claire Daly in terms of the war in Ukraine, the war in Palestine, and the need for a greater democracy both in Europe and within their own countries. I mean, a good friend of mine who's been a member of the European Parliament on 3 occasions before has been returned again, a magnificent man called Fernando Barena, and his campaign and the way they were able to pull together the youth, old people, the women's movement particularly, on a very, very anti-war, pro-independence ticket, pro-democracy ticket. That says to me there's more going on, because people didn't get the option in Germany or the option in France of actually standing up and being able to go and vote properly for a party that stood directly on those platforms, whereas in Spain it's had an effect, and I think that's fantastic. So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, I'm far from it. I mean, I'm looking at it, Finbar, and I'm seeing that the ones who have been heavily and tell us there is no genocide in Palestine, and we've got to defeat the Russians in the battlefield in Ukraine, send more. Those people have been. We've been talking about it for months on here. There's a disconnect between the voters and the leaders who are saying that. And that seems to be, as Lloyd's alluded to, that the voters' only chance has come in this election where they've actually given their governments a good kicking. I don't think they've switched their allegiances forever, but is it sending a message out to the governments, start paying attention?
I think there are key issues that the governments, the majority governments in the EU and in the UK and elsewhere, are not willing to not only to tackle. They're causing them by their policies, but they're not willing to discuss them with the public and to negotiate with the public, other than to throw labels at the public who disagree with them. And I'm talking about mass immigration as one of those key issues that people find too sensitive to talk about in a rational way. And normally, or traditionally, when we speak about left and right, left traditionally meant that you were for the workers and for the working class. And right meant that you were for the aristocracy, as it was at one time, or now for the business classes. And so I just don't think this labeling of right and left. When you hear the phrase extreme right, that says Nazis. That's what extreme right is. Nazis, essentially. Let's be clear about it. So you have a situation where a void has been created because nobody is allowed to talk about mass immigration in any EU country without being labelled as far right or extreme right, being labelled as Nazis. As a result, the mass majority of people in Ireland and across Europe are generally apolitical. When you see the voter turnout as an example quite often, they're apolitical. But there's things that they can't not see, like their neighbourhoods getting filled with people from outside of Europe who seem to be getting better deals and everything than they are. Now, Hannah Arendt, who wrote the development of totalitarianism, something like, I can't remember the exact title of her book. I've read it. And she made the point that fascism and populism, as we call it now, but fascism arises when there are groups within a demographic that are seen to have benefits and wealth, but have no purpose. And the Jews were that group in Germany. The mass immigration, and particularly the asylum system now, I'm seeing similar things. I'm seeing where asylum seekers coming into Ireland are far more likely to get a house from local authorities than an Irish person at the moment. That's a fact. That's a reality, right? And they have all of these benefits that we as Irish people don't have. And this is being seen by people who are struggling. And instead of people being able to have a proper discussion about it, when they actually raise this, I've noticed this, they're told you are far right. And because they don't know the history of politics or the philosophy of politics, they start, after a while of this, they say, well, maybe I am far right. And then they end up joining a party that is bloody far right. And so that's the mechanism by which the so-called far right are. But I think most people are having a conservative response to the phenomenal fundamental changes that are being brought and put upon them without any consultation, whether it's mass immigration into countries, which means fundamentally, whether we like to talk about it or not, in Ireland, statistically, many areas in Ireland, and in Dublin at the moment, are majority non-national at the moment. Statistically, in 40 or 50 years' time, if the demographics continue as they are, the Irish people will be the minority, and the majority religion will be Islam. And so and they will have an equal democratic vote. And many of the things that different groups, women's rights groups, gay rights groups have fought for, the basics to be able to exist in many instances, is going to come into challenge over the next number of decades. But people are not allowed to discuss that in a rational way. You're far right. You're an extremist. And that is what is. But in reality, quite often these people are not even traditional conservatives. They've no problem with gay rights. The people that are voting for these candidates and parties that are, some of them may actually be far right. There's one or two of them that are. But my overall point is that in the void of sensible discussion, that is what's contributing to this rise in what I would see as a conservative response to the trans issue. Is another issue, as an example, something that we've all been brought up with for hundreds of thousands of years, that there's male and female. We're suddenly being told now that that's not correct, and we're being forced into that. And again, there's responses to all of these woke things. And that is what is leading to the rise in a conservative response to these things, which to my mind is a conservative response, but you don't have to be a conservative to respond like that. You just have to be a regular guy, because it's extreme. What you're responding to is extreme, if you get my point. So I think the changes that we see there, you do have the left development in Spain, but that's marginal when you consider the entire EU and the direction that the EU is going in. I don't like the idea of, as an example, the rise of the conservative reactionaries in France and in Germany will mean, hopefully, less weapons and less support for the war in Ukraine. But it's also going to mean more support for Israel in what they're doing to the Palestinians in Palestine. And so politics is grown up. Politics in this day and age is a bitch, because you can support somebody fundamentally on one issue and disagree with them fundamentally on another. And that's what's making politics in this day and age so difficult. I'm finding so absolutely difficult. I don't know whether this is on purpose to confuse us or what, but you have these characters that look like they're going to be heroes, and they come out on one issue and they're deadly, they're brilliant. And then 6 months later, you hear them on another issue on Israel, for instance, and supporting genocide. And what the hell, you know? So politics is so messy.
Yeah, life was easier when I was a young man, Finbar. I had this discussion, I don't know if it was with you and Lloyd or on the Sunday show, when it was used to be left and right. Now I see it as
economics. Talk about economics.
Well, I see it as horizontal and vertical now. Our politics, the left and right has blurred so completely that, you know, as you say, there's people one day who you're listening to and going, wait a minute, that sounds very lefty, then they're very righty. But let me ask you this at the same time. I understand what you're saying about, you know, there's so many immigrants down, there's no houses, etc. But that is the point, that the immigrants get blamed. They do the same in the UK. But it's because our viewers who don't know, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, who have always ruled in Ireland, are the Tories by an Irish Celtic name. They are Tories, and they always have been. Is it not also true that it's because they haven't built enough houses? They haven't built the infrastructure. They haven't put enough schools in place. Is that not also a determining factor?
I tell you why I don't agree with that, because where I come from, so when I was growing up, where I live now, I've been in the same spot since I was a child. This used to be a village outside of town. In the last 5 to 6 years, that town has come out and surrounded this village, and it's moving all the way out in the countryside that you don't recognize. There's no countryside anymore. It's shocking. And yet the housing crisis is getting worse. And the reason is, no matter how many we build, 10 times as many are being brought in. And that's the problematic. And it's government policy. This isn't about blaming immigrants. These people are just coming for a chance, an economic chance to get on in life. They may be applying illegally or falsely as asylum seeking refuge and things like that. And we do know that between 60 and 80% of those applicants are telling lies. It's been announced by the government, you know, but they're still being facilitated and brought in, etc. And they're still being housed. Before, in many instances, Irish people who've been on the housing waiting list for so long. So we will never be able to sort this housing crisis with the sheer. I'll give an example. Our population has gone up by nearly 1 million in the last few years. And yet all our young people are leaving. It just doesn't make sense. And I used to think, when I'd hear people that were accused of being right-wing, I'd hear them using the word plantation. I thought that's hyperbole to a degree. You know, it's a bit over the top. But when I look at it now, I think it's not. When our own people are leaving. And so we signed the Marrakesh Compact in 2016. And the long title of that was for the regularization and regulation of immigration. And that's actually what they were doing. They were regularizing it. They were making it a regular thing, and they're facilitating it. So they're being told by NGOs, financed by the government, to dump their passports. That's who's telling them to do it. And it's a form of people trafficking. But the bottom line is, our services will never meet the demand. There was a GP who was on a radio station a couple of weeks ago, and he said, every non-national patient is like dealing with between 10 and 15 Irish patients. The time that they're taking up, the demands that they want, the things, the illogical, irrational things that they want. And the whole system is in a state of collapse. And there's an attempt to emotionally blackmail Irish people into accepting this and more. And where does it stop? Because the bottom line is, I believe there's a number of reasons for it. It's cheap labor, for a start, in a time of inflation. How do you stop workers demanding more money to match inflation, more wages? You bring in cheap labor, number one. Number two, I believe that it's a part of an international plan to get rid of shared national identity, so that when things are put upon us, everybody is in their own individual cage on the rat wheel, racing around that wheel, and not giving a damn about what's going on. And nobody can turn around and say, well, we have to remember what we did in 1916 when we were oppressed. They don't, well, what happened in 1960? They won't know. And so there's this breaking down of our historical and social.
But I goes back to what I said. It's, you've got a Tory government for the benefit of our audience. It's a Tory type government you've always had, and they want cheap labour. Everything's about greed and profit. It's not about social, fixing enough houses, enough roads, enough infrastructure. They want cheap labour. They want profits more than anything else. They don't give a top.
But they also want cheap fixed profits. As an example, all the buddies of our senior politicians are opening up asylum centres all over the place. IPAS centres, they call them, all over the place. They're making money hand over fist. And so, but that's cheap. Short-term gains, because they don't give a damn, because their buddies won't be in politics in 5 years' time, but they'll have made the cash. So it's not a case that there was a time, even though it was corruption, they were investing in our mining industries at least, or they were investing in this, something that was sustainable, that gave jobs. But what's happening in many of these IPAS centres is the actual asylum applicants are the ones that are working on security. Not people from outside, so you can see that relationship that's going on there. So anyway, so I think that's why there has been so much significant change in the EU elections. I don't think it's short term either, because this problem ain't going away, and other problems ain't going away. Like this continuing trundling us towards a wider European war, that's not going away. No. And the people in Ireland may be a bit stupid about it. Of all of the subjects, I think they're least informed about Ukraine and the background in Ukraine. But that's not the case as much in France, and it's not the case as much in Germany, I believe. That's why the Germans have had to come down with so many rules and laws and prohibitions in terms of what you can say about Russia and Ukraine, and now what you can say about Israel and Palestine, because they know their population is far more informed, and they have to come down with a stick.
Well, but here's the thing, Lloyd. When you look at, there are different, for the people in France, for example, they have got the choice of Le Pen and Macron. They are completely different. They are very different parties, very different ideology. In Germany, the Greens took an absolute thumping. They lost about 18% of their vote. The SPD, that's Schulz's party, they were absolutely battered. And the AfD have grown up. They've got choices. But here's the problem. The two big elections from our point of view in this group this year are the UK general election and the United States president elections. Now, the difference is now, if we've got a government just now who are pro-Israel, there is no genocide, they say. They are pro-Ukraine, where, the war started in February 22, and we've got to beat the Russians. But both parties say the same, no matter what government we move, we get the same. It's the same in the United States of America. Trump might stop Ukraine, but he's going to go all in for Gaza. The people don't really have a choice. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. At least in some of the European countries, there is a choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what I was trying to allude to earlier on. I mean, I have to say that here in unfortunately, Scotland still being part of the UK, I find the national broadcasters' obsession with Trump and the US election. Now, it's happened all, throughout my life, but the current obsession I find is deeply, deeply unhealthy, because it's effectively moving people to the concept of American politics are as important as politics in the UK. Now, that may well be true in the bigger global issues, but it should not be a central part of our political discourse to discuss the politics and the machinations of the United States, when in actual fact we're having a general election here, and there is no examination in detail of the positions taken by those who are fighting that particular election. I find it odd. It's like our journalists seem to be using the national broadcasting media to beef up their CV so that they can get to be the next Washington correspondent. It seems to be more driven by that than anything else. Because in reality, whether Donald Trump becomes the next president or Joe Biden's the next president, ain't going to make any difference to the price of renting a house in Niddrie and Craigmillar or anything else. These things don't touch us directly, and in some ways it's kind of referring to something that Finbar said, that it's like it's defocusing people. It's don't look here, look over there. Things aren't as that bad here because look what the hell's happening in the United States. Now, that's one part of it. We all know what the United States does is incredibly important to most countries in the world because of the power that they exercise. But the other part of that is who exercises the power over the United States. And what we've discovered over the past months, while the slaughter and the genocide is going on in Gaza, is that 90% of the elected politicians in Washington have, as a member of their staff, someone who represents Israeli interests. Now, that in itself is utterly and completely shocking. If you were to say that 90% of the politicians in the United States had someone on their staff who was there to represent the position of the Chinese government or the Russian government.
Could I just interrupt you, Lloyd, on that? It's a very important point. I've got a video, if I may just play it, to back up exactly what you're saying. And this is Tucker Carlson. And
in my opinion, Western civilization is reaching a point into it will start failing.
Everybody but me has an AIPAC person.
What's that mean, an AIPAC person?
It's like your babysitter, your AIPAC babysitter, who is always talking to you for AIPAC. They're probably a constituent in your district, but they are firmly embedded in AIPAC. And
every member has someone like this?
That's how it works on the Republican side. And when they come to DC, you go have lunch with them. And they've got your cell number, and you have conversations with them.
That's absolutely crazy.
I've had 4 members of Congress say, I'll talk to my AIPAC person. And it's literally what we call them, my AIPAC guy. I'll talk to my AIPAC guy and see if I can get him to dial those ads back.
Why have I never heard this before?
Why would they want to tell their constituents that they've basically got a buddy system with somebody who's representing a foreign country? It doesn't benefit the congressman for people to know that, so they're not going to tell you that.
There you go, confirming exactly what you say, Lloyd. They've all got an AIPAC. I must have had an Israeli guy in their staff telling them what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's happening. It's happening here in the UK as well. Not quite to the same level, but certainly in the Labour Party. I mean, effectively, if in this general election, if Labour are returned, you're effectively returning the Likud Party. Mm-hmm. The involvement in the Labour Party, the Labour Friends of Israel, the infiltration of the Labour Party, the false and quite scurrilous so-called anti-Semitism investigation that the Labour Party had, which in reality wasn't about anti-Semitism. It was about people who had a less than rosy-tinted view of the state of Israel, but they had to be removed. The fact that we've got the leader of the Labour Party at the moment is someone who has stated very clearly that he supports the concept of Zionism. Now, that is an absolutely extraordinary thing for anyone to say anywhere, because if Keir Starmer thinks it's going to bring him votes, it's the very opposite that's happening. I mean, we can see that from the number of independent candidates that have come up basically on the basis of challenging the Labour Party and its attitude, particularly in the issue of Palestine, but also on the issue of Ukraine and the broader war movement. But again, it's this feeling that we're living in the 51st state of the United States. That all of the focus seems to be on follow the leader, follow the leader. And in some ways, this tells us that, this is the beginning of the end of days for the post-imperial power that is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Its poodle nature to America has now led it into being a kind of shadow version of the United States. And our politicians are happily allowing the lobbyists of the Israeli government to take an active part in their politics. I mean, we even have it here in Scotland. Yeah. Only 2 years ago, a large group of Conservative members of the Scottish Parliament went to Israel on a fact-finding mission. It wasn't a fact-finding mission. It was get propagandaed by, by the Israeli government, and they all came back and have been extremely silent on the whole issue of what's happening in Gaza at present. One of the things I've always wanted to have as a result of independence is the right for us to start with a clean slate, to say, right, we're new. We're a historic, ancient country, but we're new in the politics of the 20th or the 21st century. And we have to start with a blank slate. We have to say, we're not going to be in this gang, we're not going to be in that gang, which is why I have, despite its many, many flaws and faults, admiration for the position that Ireland currently holds, which is to be a neutral country outside of NATO and play a very active and important part in the United Nations. Now, that's where I want to be in Scotland, but because of our constant linkage to the United States, a constant linkage, particularly in our National Party, to British politics, no one is thinking in these broader terms of where can we be in the future. No one's thinking in terms of exactly the fact of start with an absolutely clean slate. We can build our own, build our own connections. I mean, there was a wonderful thing when I was growing up, was we used to hear referred to on television and regularly and read in the newspapers was about the non-aligned countries. Not even the neutral countries, they were non-aligned, which was Yugoslavia, Finland, Sweden, and Ireland. Now we talk about them as the neutral countries. Well, I'll tell you, if it means not having force-fed US politics and UK politics, then Scotland has to have the debate itself about neutrality, about being non-aligned. But it requires a proper examination of where we are now and how corrupted our own politics have become, because we do politics in the British way, which leads you to doing politics in the American way. So we have this circumstance now where the only time the politicians come out to play, as you and I have discovered over the past few weeks, Roddy, is when there's an election around. We're not having the big debates about the big ideas. And this is the real problem. There's the elitism of our political class doesn't want to have debates about things because they don't want the people who they effectively exclude but require them to vote for them every 3, 4 or 5 years. They don't want them to have these debates because they've locked themselves into this international global system where their friendships with international leaders or their support for the international leader of the week, who it happens to be, is more important than representing the people who put them there in the first place. And this kind of is a circular thing. It goes back to what's happened in the European elections and to some degree in the local elections in the Republic this week. There's a total disconnect. And the disconnect has not been created by the people. The disconnect has been created by the political class who have internationalized themselves so that they're now an international political class. And the divorcing from the ordinary people gets greater. The division between them, the gap between them, grows and grows on a daily basis. The good side of that is that some people are waking up to that, and that's where independent candidates, new ideas are beginning to come up, slowly bubble up from the bottom, and let's hope they have some form of success in the near future.
Absolutely. And on that, today, I just got word through, there are, in the UK general election coming up, there are going to be 357 independent candidates, a record ever throughout the UK. There's enough, if they were elected throughout the UK, they could form a government. There are enough. No, that means...
And I presume that's not including parties like the Workers' Party, who seem...
No, just independents, purely independents. Purely independence, which brings me to the question I was going to ask you, Finn, but there was a lot of extra independent candidates, I believe, in Ireland. How did they do this year?
They did quite well. So proportionately speaking, 25%, slightly more than 25% of the overall vote, which is big in itself.
Wow.
If you're looking from the outside at the moment, and even in the Irish Republic itself, all the media headlines are saying, that Sinn Féin got a trouncing and that the government parties got a boost. In reality, it was the worst local elections in the history for the governing parties. They still maintained their dominance in many areas, but it was one of the worst ones, not one of the better ones. And the story about big Sinn Féin losses and about the rise in government parties was a story that emerged in the middle, if not the early stages of the tallying of the vote results. And yet those headlines have remained, even though the circumstances have actually changed. So Sinn Féin did better than they did in 2019 in the local elections. But looking at the headlines, you would think they have done worse. The independence is a new phenomenon to a degree. And in that, I'll also talk about small parties that are emerging as well. Again, they all got labeled right-wing or extreme right and language like this to try to put them down. They've all done pretty well too. It's not groundbreaking yet, but the Irish Republic is one of the only countries in Europe that allows immigrants or non-nationals to vote in its local elections. So we had an extra 300,000 voters that were registered to vote in the last 12 months. At the same time, our own young people are leaving. We only have the entire amount of people entitled to vote is about 3 million or something like that, less than 3 million in Ireland. So you had this 300,000 extra voters. You had NGOs that were putting advertising on Facebook and on X and things like that they were busing from IPAS centres and immigrants down to vote. And the quotation on some of their actual posts was to make sure they vote correctly. So these are people who are in IPAS and immigrant centres owned by either the politicians or the friends of the governing politicians, who are being bussed down by NGOs and often the politicians themselves to be taught how to vote correctly. Many of these people don't have a word of English, have no idea about Irish politics. So even though the governing parties had that advantage, they still didn't do as well as they've done in many other elections. So that advantage will not be there in our national elections. And I think the outcome will be far more negative for the governing parties in our parliamentary, or what we call our Dáil elections, when they won't have that benefit of those. Now, I believe that there will be a campaign, no doubt, over the next few months to try to allow non-national people to vote in our national elections. I have no doubt that's going to be the talk that's going to be talked over the next while. But it could end up like New Caledonia a few weeks ago, where Macron tried to make constitutional changes so that French immigrants could vote, and they would have outvoted the native population. What did they do? They rioted and they burnt the bloody islands down. They weren't going to put up with it. And I'm telling you, the way Ireland's going at the moment, with this extreme language that's been used to people who just want to have a conversation, the extreme vitriol and hate against them, and they label them as extreme and far right. Far right, to call somebody far right is to call them a Nazi. Let's be clear about this. It's to call them somebody who would like to see the elimination of races and who believe that one race is more superior than another. That's what a far right person is. The mass majority of people in Ireland are not like that, but they can see before their eyes that their communities are being fundamentally changed. And the potential for Ireland, as an example, in many parts of Dublin, the non-national community now outnumber the native Dublin community. That's being seen more and more right around the country. You had some villages in Ireland voting in which the non-national population was greater than the population of the village itself. They were voting in those local areas. But it means that in 30 or 40 years' time, if not less, and this is a conversation, this is not saying that one race is better than another, but it means that Ireland, the advances that we've made in women's rights, in gay rights, things like that, can come under threat if we have a majority Muslim population who will have a right, a democratic right to vote, to retrench away from those changes and to take away those rights that people have at the moment. So we have a right to have that conversation about what the future, not just far away future, but what the short to medium term future of our country structurally, culturally, nationally, every way will look. We have that right to have that conversation, but we are being told that we don't. And the way we're told is this: you don't have a right to choose who your neighbor is. That kind of sounds sensible in a way, doesn't it? That sounds rational. But do you have a right to choose when there's purposeful demographic engineering happening, because that is ultimately what is happening in the Irish Republic at the moment. It's social engineering and demographic engineering, and it's actually creating racism. People who are apolitical, who were never involved in politics, it's so obvious. So, for instance, you walk downtown, any regular town in Ireland now, at least 50 to 60 people of the people you see are people who don't speak English and have a different skin color, and quite often they're Muslims. And so people want to talk about this sudden change. But when they do talk about it, they've been called extreme right wing. They've been called basically Nazis. And so they say to them, but there's the far right, that's the label that's used. So many of these apolitical people, after being hearing this 10 times, they say to themselves, well, maybe I am far right. And they end up joining a tiny fringe far right party, and it starts growing. But it's not because they're far right. It's because they were denied the right to have a reasonable, rational conversation about these things without being labelled.
Yeah, but here's the thing, Finbar. I hear what you're saying. But for example, if we look at Palestine, there are 2 million people being bombed. Every bomb that's landed on them, every shell that's landed on them, every rocket that's landed on them has come from America. In fact, and we'll be talking about it later in the show, is that there was even a hint of American special forces helping the Israelis go into Gaza. Now, these people, every university, every hospital, every home has been burned to smithereens. The same happened in Libya. The same is happening in parts of Syria and parts of South Lebanon. Well, these people are going, and where are they going? They're coming into Europe. They're coming to Ireland. They're coming wherever they can get in. Maybe if we stop bombing them in their own homes and destroying them, we wouldn't have that problem. Maybe so it goes back to these governments we should be talking to. They're the ones that are not building the infrastructure. They're the ones that are killing these people. They're removing their chance of making a living. They're removing their homes, their hospitals, their universities, their schools. So what anyone would do is you go and look where you can to make a life for yourself and your family.
No, I fully get that. That's what I'm saying. This is all about policymakers. But ultimately, the people on the ground, the working class people on the ground, and some of the middle class, they are seeing this, and they don't make that connection. And even when they do make that connection, the bottom line is, how can they fix that problem over there? That's not within their hands to be able to fix that. But here locally, they can identify this sudden change in the demographics that they're seeing, and they can do something locally about it. But they're not making that connection. But just going back to the idea that people are apolitical, and then because they're being labelled far right, they're being drawn to parties whose originators may be a little bit more far right than you or I would be comfortable with. So those people then are meeting people who fill them with the bullshit propaganda from Israel. And so suddenly these people who, if the actual facts of the matter about the Israeli-Palestinian, especially in Ireland, was presented in front of them, they would clearly see the injustice of what Israel is doing. But now they're being drawn into these little cliques of groups because they have nowhere politically to go, because everyone else is calling them extremists, far right. And so you have that connection where I've been surprised with some of the people that I've spoken to about the lack of sympathy for the people of Gaza. I've actually been shocked, and yet to be against what's going on in Ukraine. And it's because they've been drawn into this, and quite often it starts in the United States as political speak and this political influence, and you have people who are very off the cuff and don't think about what they're saying, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and people like that, and who will say this stuff. Take Ben Shapiro as a perfect example. Oh. He came out as an advocate for free speech during the COVID lockdown. A lot of what he was saying was sensible. People linked into him because of that. They weren't far right or far left. They just saw the sense in a lot of this stuff about the vaccines. My friends are dropping dead after getting vaccines, for God's sake. So the only people were talking about it was people like Ben Shapiro. And then he turns out to be an Israeli fanatic, a Zionist fanatic, who's delighted to see people being killed in Gaza. And so regular people are then in his sphere of influence now, because they weren't allowed to talk about the COVID thing without being called an extremist. And now they're not being allowed to talk about mass immigration and other issues without being called extremist. And then they end up by default in the extremist camp.
Roddy, can I just say that what Finbar's saying is to some degree is reflected in the attitudes that are coming out of particularly England, less so Scotland. But the root of this problem seems to be that the political elites have made decisions like a lot of decisions that have been made in the European Union and the European Parliament particularly, where we have to deal with the situation. And the politicians get together and say, yeah, we'll deal with it. But then you get a situation like Ireland, where you already had a huge housing crisis, an enormous housing crisis that's been in existence for a while. But the government has decided that to be good Europeans and to stay pals with their pals in Brussels, that they will follow exactly the same policy. Whereas the people on the ground, the ordinary constituents, the voters, know about the housing crisis, know that they're not addressing the housing crisis, and are deeply, deeply annoyed at the fact that the government seems not to pay any attention to that.
Not just that, Lloyd. People that are on the housing waiting list for 12 or 15 years with 3, 4, 5 kids watch as the house that becomes available down the street, the people who just came into the country 2 weeks ago are moving into it. And you can say, how can anybody not be pissed off at that?
Well, exactly, Finbar. But the problem is the politicians manipulate it in such a fashion, as you described, that somehow it becomes the problem of the immigrants, when in reality, the people we should be holding to account are the politicians who did not, as Roddy said earlier, put the infrastructure in place. I mean, it's dead straightforward. Europe decides that there will be an apportioning of the refugees created primarily by European and North American policy in what we used to term the third world. That's what's driving it. But it ends up that the immigrants get the blame, when in reality it's the politicians who are to blame, who have agreed to do something which they don't have the means to deal with, except by taking away from their own people. And in a country of a population of 3.5 million, then you have 300,000 people in a very short period of time, then that is going to cause friction, because you can't add 10% to your population without people kind of paying attention, most especially when those people have been guaranteed, because of the agreements the politicians have made with the other politicians in Brussels and Strasbourg, that you must provide X, Y, and Z.
Own door accommodation.
Exactly. Now, if the politicians who make those agreements without saying, hold on a minute, we need to build 20,000 houses, we need to build 50,000 houses, we will require another 150 GPs, we will need an extra 300 hospital beds. All of the things that you need are not being put in place, and as a result of that, people who are, as you described, apolitical, or people who are not as interested as anoraks like us, will immediately blame the obvious, which is the people who are different. And the only people to blame for that are virtue signalling politicians. We've got them here in Scotland too. We had the Scottish government brought in a passenger liner to put Ukrainian refugees on a passenger liner in the docks here in Leith in Edinburgh. Now, we've got in Edinburgh about 900 people homeless. That's not including the 20-odd thousand on the housing list. But now everybody said, it's a terrible shame, let's help the refugees. Now, if your government can move so quickly to find accommodation for the Ukrainian refugees, why is it that they're not able to do exactly the same for the people who are homeless or the people who are on the housing waiting list? If you don't deal with these things, then you are responsible for the friction created. You are responsible for the rise of the right.
But here's the thing. Can I make another key point here? Because it's almost, somebody might say, well, if that was, at the most, it was negligence, that it was a sudden panic. But here's the thing. When the inward immigration crisis in Ireland is raised, government parties and representatives constantly refer to asylum seekers and refugees. And yet the statistics show us that the mass majority of people coming in from outside of Europe into Ireland are coming on work visas and student visas. And yet the refugees are getting blamed for all of the capacity issues. Now, the refugee application is being heavily abused, no doubt about it. But the bottom line is the mass majority. So in 2022, there was about 320,000 national insurance numbers issued to people from outside Europe into Ireland. 320,000 in 1 year, right? Of that, there was 80,000 or so Ukrainians. The other 240,000 were mainly work visas and student visas, because the asylum applications for that year was around 10 to 15,000. Who was the rest of them? Cheap labor being brought into this country. That's what it was all about, to keep stop workers from seeking wage rises because of inflation. That's what that was all about. And the government are purposefully encouraging people to blame asylum seekers, because every time the subject is raised, they go straight to the asylum seekers and abuse against asylum seekers, asylum seekers, when the reality is, so I spoke to some people who are running in elections last week, and I put the question to them, is there a danger that when people with a public profile start using phrases like sexual predators and labeling all people coming into the country sexual predators, is there a danger that we're actually creating risk for everybody that comes into the country, that they will be labeled as that and attacked into the future? And is there a responsibility on the part of local representatives to actually take action to mitigate that? Some of the replies were surprising. One woman said to me, yeah, it's terrible, because the people that are coming to work here and are working, well, they're different to the ones that are coming and the asylum seekers that are not working. And I was thinking to myself, well, if your issue, I didn't say it, but if your issue is capacity of services and houses, then it shouldn't matter whether they're working or not. The bottom line is anybody coming in to take up another house is a problem, whether they're working or not. So there was this attempt to try to, I don't know how to put it, to classify people coming into the country, that the asylum seekers and the people that are not working are the real problem causers. When in reality, if we're going to accept it, the real problem causers are the people on working visas and student visas. I think half of Brazil lives in Dublin. That's the truth of it. It looks fantastic. Some of them look amazing to see going down the street. But, no houses to live in.
If it's Brazilians, you might get a good football team in a couple of years.
And there's plenty of post-game entertainment too.
You might also get a very good day. What do you call it? Carnival. Going down Dublin could be good.
Mardi Gras.
Mardi Gras, there you go. But there's something earlier that Finbar mentioned, Lloyd, is how the media, the corrupt media in Ireland, exaggerated the Sinn Féin to a beating, but they didn't. But, they're saying, yeah, Sinn Féin's on the way and it's all over, guys, come back to Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, all is forgiven sort of propaganda. We've seen it. Now, on Wednesday of this week, or last week, whatever you want to put it, a new opinion poll came out in Scotland, and yet again, Lloyd, 53% of people are in favour of Scottish independence. And the SNP vote still heading south, Alpes flatlining. But there's 53% of the Scottish population want independence if they get an opportunity to go for it. So we've got the exact same problem as Finbar's mentioned also, NGOs. We've got the exact same again. They're working against the Scottish people and the majority will. So it's the same. The neoliberals are doing everything they can to keep the status quo.
Absolutely, but that's their job, Roddy. I mean, we have a different problem in Scotland from the problem in Ireland. Is Ireland's problems are Ireland's problems, and the Irish can solve them. Mm-hmm. We can't. We're not an independent country. We have. Neither
are we. We're stuck with Brussels. Let's be real about this.
Well, yeah. Let's not be angels dancing on a pin. You're absolutely right, Finbar. Yes, you're trapped by Europe. We could have been trapped by Europe as well. But being trapped by Europe ain't nothing like being trapped by
the
Brits. When it comes right down to it. What we've got, what we can solve within the United Kingdom is minimal compared with the possibility that Ireland has to solve problems and issues. Now, You really foxed me with that one, actually. The mind's
I would agree
like
to it. So, for instance, let's take the immigration issue, and we won't harp on about that.
Yeah.
But the Irish government signed up to international agreements and to European agreements of late. They're about to sign up to it. But those agreements do say you take numbers to your capacity. It's just that our particular political parties in power are lapdogs, and they just want to go further than anybody else to show how wonderfully generous they have been. And so, but yeah, I would agree. When the British, well, they still control the north, but up until devolution and even after it, the bottom line is number 10 can come down and stop anything if they want to stop it, whether it's local planning issues. So we've seen that with mining in the north of Ireland, up in the Sparran Mountains, communities coming together to stop Canadian company Dalridian from opening up poisonous, toxic gold mines in the beautiful Sparran Mountains and within their communities. They thought they had won at a local level to stop it, but with the local authorities and councils and everything else, it was all agreed it was going to be stopped. Number 10 just going to say, no, that's going ahead.
Yeah. But that's, I mean, in some ways, they're kind of rolling it back. That, though trapped by Europe, you don't have, Brussels can't really step in on something as fundamental as that within the Republic. Whereas Britain can do that in the north, and it does it to us all the time. I mean, this is not the time and place to talk about it. I'm sure we will in the future. We're about to be created into a country of cantonments called free ports and special economic zones, where the normal law of our country, remembering that our law is different from the law in the rest of the United Kingdom, our law will no longer apply over huge swathes of our country because of the creation of these free ports. Now, there is little or nothing we can do about that except getting off our hind legs, shouting about it, and leading, hopefully, a popular campaign against it. Because our politicians are entirely trapped by the concept, and ultimately, it's the decision of London about whether these things go forward or don't. Now, but again, this seems to come back to the same issue over and over again. The politicians and the elite politicians talk to each other, decide what is good for us, but what they're really deciding is what's good for them. That's sold to us as being good for us. And as each month, each day, each week goes by, the divide between the electorate, the people, and the political parties grows wider and wider and wider. Some political parties over the years, and this came to me when you were talking about the level of inward immigration into Ireland, and why that suits the political elites, and why you would bus people to the polling stations, because on those buses you say to them, it was Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil that let you come in. You know, you got to pay them back, which is exactly the same thing, which unfortunately, well beautifully actually bounced back on the British, who were suggesting that 1.5 million people from Hong Kong should come to Britain. And I can't remember exactly which Tory it was, but they let it slip that this would guarantee them all of those votes.
So it's gerrymandering. It's gerrymandering.
Yeah, absolutely.
But can I also say, Lloyd, while you're on that topic, in 2014, the British government were saying to all the immigrants and the EU people in Scotland, oh, you'll be out the EU if you vote yes, so you better vote no. And that's exactly what they did. 80% of the EU citizens voted no.
Roddy, I'm sure I've told you this story. I don't know if Finbar's heard it, but we had great relationship with the European community in Niddrie and Craigmillar, and oddly enough, most of them actually did go out and vote yes, but there were particular communities, particularly the Polish, who the Better Together campaign made a really big effort. They were phoning them constantly from Polish-speaking call centres set up in Manchester, deliberately to target these people. And I remember standing outside a polling station. There were a couple that I'd spoken to for nearly every Saturday morning for about 8 months. We would stop at the stall, we'd have a chat, they would tell me about Poland and Poland's struggle for its freedom over hundreds of years, and they were committed to supporting Scottish independence. And the two of them standing as they walked towards me in the polling station, and the husband started crying, saying, we can't do it. They phoned us and told us we'll be thrown out the country. And they weren't alone in that, but they were genuinely, these were people who so wanted to stay in the country. If they hadn't been harassed, if they hadn't had that pressure put on them, they'd have happily voted to live in an independent Scotland. But because of the fear that was driven into them, and they felt a real emotional connection to us. But as the man said to me himself, he said, I have to think of my family first.
Yeah.
And then that it was brutal, absolutely brutal behaviour by the better.
And that links into the point that I made earlier, Lloyd, about how do you take away a sense of sovereignty and independence from a nation? You fill it up with people. Like, as an example, I'm not saying this is what's going on, but quite often when you look at instances in the 100-Year War and the 7-Year War and what happened in Ireland and so many other places, kings had to take soldiers and groups of soldiers from other countries to come and fight for them. You know, and it's a similar thing, except the fight now is the democratic process, where they have to take people from other countries to vote for them, and they have to pick their voters, not their voters picking them, if you understand me.
Well, look, you know, historically, why do we have the issue in the occupied six counties? Why did that happen? Because of a deliberate political decision by a king of England, king of Scotland as well, unfortunately, to control a country. You ship people in. And unfortunately, that 300, 400, 500-year culture of those that came to live in the north of Ireland who were not culturally Irish has led to the conflict over all this period, a conflict that's still resonating in the 21st century because of the behavior of someone in the 16th century. It's absolutely incredible. And in some ways,
and disgusting.
Maybe we should be looking at things in that length of space. You talked about, you know, the demographic of Ireland changing over 50 years. What's it going to be like in an even longer period of time? But it's like looking at what's the problem we've got today? How did it get there? And you look at the six counties of the north of Ireland and the problem that we have today, 400, 500 years ago, it began there.
Oh, we also have a plantation, Lloyd. We have 500,000 English coming up since the referendum. They're there, they get a vote, they vote for England every time. And that's exactly what's happened in the 6 occupied counties. But the other thing, there'll be no free ports in the 6 occupied counties. No, of course I would. Ladies and gentlemen, the clock is beating us again, as always. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion about the European Union elections and what's happening globally. Our next show will be about some other things that might be of great interest to you. But until we see you again, you and yours, please take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.